Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Governor Herbert signs hundreds of bills into law and issues several rare vetoes. What impact will these new laws have? Will the legislature seek a veto override? Utahns take part in historic marches. Are lawmakers listening? What effect will the protests have? Candidates turn up the heat as they speak out about controversial issues and start explaining their positions. How are voters reacting? Will this affect the election? And who already has their sights set on 2020? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Nicole Nixon, reporter with KUER, Jay Evenson, senior editorial columnist for the Deseret News, and Thomas Burr, Washington bureau chief for the Salt Lake Tribune. Glad to have you all with us this week. This has been a interesting week for the governor. He's been busy signing bills, 498 of them. He signed into law, let 2 go into effect without a signature, but he vetoed 3. I want to talk about 2 of those. Jay, let's start with you on this. They both had to do with the separation of powers issue, with the legislature wanting to get involved in lawsuits and with the Attorney General's office. Give us some of the context behind this and why these 2 seem to be in a battle right now.
Well, this actually has been going on for years and years, this battle in Utah, and it's hard to remember that both the executive and legislative branches are controlled by the same party because they've been battling at this. The governor will argue that the legislature's job is to make law, and the executive branch's job is to enforce law and defend law, and that by the legislature trying to say that they can step in when it comes to lawsuits that are challenging law, they're breaching that separation there and actually doing what the executive branch ought to be doing. There's another measure they've put to the ballots here in the fall, which is going to allow people to decide whether the legislature should have the power, the power to call themselves into session, which they argue they're the only branch of government that can't actually decide when to go to work, and they want to do that. That's, we're in a state with a part-time citizen legislature, and that would be kind of a giant leap for them to do that. But this is part of a long, ongoing fight in this state going over decades over this separation of powers and the legislature feeling like the executive has a little bit too much of that power.
Nicole, let's talk about what the process is going forward here, right? So we have a historic kind of fight between these 2 groups, but both of these bills that were vetoed by the governor were passed with 2/3 majority, right? In the House and the Senate. So what is the process going forward? And tell us how likely it is that we'll see a veto override session.
So legislative leaders are going to spend the next week or 2 or 3 polling the members of their chambers to see if they actually do have the numbers to pursue a veto override. Like you said, they need a 2/3 majority. Both of these bills passed with more than that, but at this point it's more of like, do they want to pursue this fight? Do they actually want to override a governor's veto, which is something that doesn't happen very often. And then they do need a call, if they decide to, call that veto override session by the first week in May.
So Tommy, let's talk about the rationale a little bit here, because we have this great historical understanding that Jay has talked about, which is absolutely right. But do you think there is a sense in the state from our legislature that the executive branch is just doing it wrong? Is this about preserving their power, or are they just doing it wrong?
It's all a fight about who has control, who has the most power, and I think the legislature is always a little jealous of the governor for having this power, and they want to take it back and say, what about us? We're a co-equal branch, right? And we want to have equal powers. This is nothing new to Utah. This is happening in other states. It always has been. It happens with the Congress and the White House with certain issues. So this is just like, as Jay was saying, we just keep going back to this over and over again. When I covered the legislature in 04-05, same issue.
The interesting thing to watch is now outgoing Speaker Greg Hughes has designs on the governor's office. If he should become governor, I wonder what his position would be on this whole issue, because he's been very strong in arguing that the legislature should have more power. If he becomes chief of the executive branch, it'd be interesting to watch.
May change his opinion a bit. Maybe go ahead.
They mentioned that this has been a historic argument, but I want to mention that it's flared up because in the last year we've seen these two branches of government sort of butting heads, which started when the governor called the special election to replace former Congressman Jason Chaffetz. The legislature wanted some input on the parameters of that election, and they felt snubbed that the governor did all of that without any of their input. So I think these three bills you saw this session was a little bit of still soreness over that.
Yeah, maybe so. And I want to pick up that thread with this great insight you gave us, Jay, because we talk about the speaker, maybe changing his opinion when and if he's the governor. But we have a couple of other interesting members of the legislature that are up for important positions that have weighed in on this as well. Greg Hughes, but also Brad Wilson, Majority Leader in the House. He came out this week. He has his eyes set maybe on the speaker, a House position with Greg Hughes leaving. Tell us about this posturing you think from him, because he's saying these passed by large majorities, and anytime that happens, a veto override session is appropriate.
Well, he's the House Majority Leader. If there's anyone that's going to try and wrangle the votes and put the majority in line, it will be Majority Leader Brad Wilson.
Okay, we'll watch that one closely. Jay, another interesting bill signed by the governor. The state of Utah is now in the marijuana business. All right? Yes. These bills were signed. Tell us what some of those parameters are on the bills that were passed, and let's talk about what's going to happen with the initiative.
Well, the bill, the right to try bill, is quite a bit different from the initiative that's circulating. The right to try bill is very narrow, but it basically gives people who are in hospice, who are toward the end of their life, the right to try marijuana or variations or extracts of marijuana as a way to alleviate pain or to alleviate suffering. I think there was some hope in the legislature that by doing this they might diffuse the initiative somewhat. The initiative goes much farther, but recent opinion polls show that a vast majority of Utahns support this initiative, and I believe they say they have enough signatures to get on the ballot.
Well, let's talk about that. You're right. 75% of Utahns polled recently said they support medicinal use of marijuana, but the stage is being set in an interesting way in Utah as to whether or not that's what this initiative does. Tommy, it looks like they've got the signatures to have this go on the ballot, but the governor has come out talking about this initiative, saying that he doesn't necessarily support it. Why is that?
Well, I think we'll see how much pull the governor has with Utahns when it comes down to this, because it looks like it's going to be on the ballot. And let's also just clarify that this is medicinal marijuana. This is not recreational like where I live in D.C., where marijuana is completely legal and you can do what you want with it pretty much. If this passes, but we also need to note that this is how California started down the road to recreational marijuana. That's how Colorado, how Washington State, a lot of them started with medicinal marijuana initiatives that and then ended up with legalizing marijuana usage. The governor obviously doesn't like it, but he has won vote this election.
Well, let's show a graphic, because I want to get into this for just a moment on the governor and setting the stage. He said, because our new law, ties it to that House Bill 197, promotes medical science and public safety in ways absent from this initiative petition, I will actively oppose the medical cannabis initiative. So let's talk about that for a second. Jay, if it's just one vote from the governor, this actively oppose posturing from the governor is kind of new. What's he going to do, and how will people react?
That's a very good question. Is there going to be any organized opposition that will be doing television, radio commercials? Will the governor be involved in that? What is the value of an opposition from the governor? And of course, there's another big player out there, and that's the LDS Church. And I think a lot of people are they've already weighed in and said we have concerns about this, but how active are they going to be? Are there going to be more statements? The polls show, I think 64% of active LDS say they support this measure. Would that change if the church came out with a stronger statement?
Go ahead, Nicole.
I just think it's interesting that he chose this week to come out against it. He signed this. He signed these two bills to legalize medical marijuana in Utah, and he's not the only lawmaker that opposes this. I've heard from several members of the legislature that worry about the initiative passing and it opening the door to recreational use. Though I think it should be pointed out that this initiative is still It's much more broad than what the legislature did pass, but it's still pretty narrow considering the states surrounding Utah.
Okay, go ahead, Tommy.
I was going to ask Nicole a question because I don't know the answer on this. If the initiative passes, what does the legislature do to kind of rein it in? If they're against it, if the governor's against it, lawmakers against it, do we see in the next session efforts to pull it back in some form?
That's a great question. I think we'd have to watch the legislature to see if they do try to rein it in.
Well, that certainly is an interesting conversation. Go ahead,
Well,
Jay.
lawmakers hate initiatives, and there's a very interesting history of initiatives in Utah. We were the second state to allow them in the early 1900s, but it took 16 years after that for the legislature to pass enabling legislation, and then they made it. You think it's hard today. In those days, you had to find someone who had the authority to take an oath, and you had to go visit them and with them as a witness sign a petition. We didn't actually have an initiative on the ballot for 60 years. And so the legislature believes, hey, we're the ones that are elected to make law, and it's better to go through the process of hearings and debates and amendments rather than just have an initiative that people vote up and down. Now the question is, what are they going to do if it passes? Are they going to go against the will of the people? And I don't know.
Tommy, talk about the state for just a moment. This is the last piece on this because let's just say it gets on the ballot because it looks like it might have enough signatures. And some of these people start coming out against it. But those that have been promoting this initiative say all these comments about this leading to recreational use are just scare tactics.
Certainly, that's going to be part of the advertising campaign. That's the argument against. But let's remember that Utah, as it's a conservative state, but it's also a very libertarian state. Utahns do not like the government telling them what to do, what they can or cannot do. And deep down, I'm from southern Utah, and down there, get the government out of our lives. And so that plays really well in a medical marijuana situation.
Okay. We have had people in Utah talking about issues that matter to them, particularly as it relates to guns this week. We had the March for Our Lives. Nicole, let's talk about this for just a moment because we had 8,000 people marching, one of the biggest marches in the history of the state.
Yeah, bigger certainly than anything we've seen at the state capitol in recent years. This is something that has been, we've been talking about gun control and gun laws and sort of tipping our toes into that debate for a few years now. But certainly with the Parkland shooting, we've seen that ramp up a lot more. Utah students have organized this march. They got a lot of people out there. There was also this counter march that we saw that, of course, in Utah, a very pro-Second Amendment state, had 1,000 counter marchers supporting the Second Amendment and their right to bear arms.
Jay, how significant is it that this was a march led by students?
Well, it's great to see because it's been a long time since students have really been engaged politically. But you look at the demographics, the age breakup of any recent election, and that 18 to 24 demographic is dead last in voter turnout. In order for this to get any kind of staying power, I think, there's going to have to be a real effort to get 18-year-olds to register and to get them to vote. As they move into that voting age, if they remain politically active and vote, then yes, this could be a significant thing. However, it is a little bit confusing in Utah because I heard some students in Utah County saying, well, we're not really for gun control, but we want to see an end to the shooting. So I'm not sure. Nationwide, I think this movement is cohesive and is for gun control. I'm not so sure it's that cohesive in Utah.
Can I jump in? It was very powerful. The Washington March in D.C., I've heard anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people. It's hard to actually estimate the people when you can't see the end of where they are. It was incredibly powerful. The students who spoke were really professionally well articulate of what they wanted to do. The question is, can they keep that movement going? Can you move this beyond one rally or rally itself to legislation, to action in Congress? Because this isn't something that can just be, let's talk about it now and forget about it. We've seen mass shootings how many times? We talk about it every time we have a mass shooting. What can we do? What can we do? What happens now to keep that going?
Actually, I think what happens, and unfortunately, is you're going to have another shooting. I hope to God we don't. And then this goes away. But I think if history is correct, we're going to see more things, and that will probably keep this going and keep the marches going.
Tommy, you are home based in Washington, D.C., dealing with our federal lawmakers on this issue. How are they receiving these protests and the kind of the petitions from students?
It's what you expect. You know, they are welcoming, glad the students are engaged, that it's great to have them, you know, get involved in the political process. But then they say, if you're a Republican, you say, well, look, we've enacted, you know, we're trying to get more money for training for teachers. We're trying to say how to spot the maybe troubled student who may be apt to do some kind of a shooting. And we can, you know, have more resources for you know, police and schools. Isn't that the answer? If you're a Democrat, you're saying, well, we need gun control. The problem is they're so divided. I don't know if they can ever find a way to actually pass any meaningful gun reform or action that would take away the ability for these shootings to continue.
Okay, I want to switch gears for just a moment. We talk about honesty in politics from time to time. Sometimes those two don't always go together, but Jay, what an interesting poll the Deseret News did this week about dishonesty in politics. I want to give a couple numbers for you to give a comment about, if that's all right. This is about whether or not dishonesty is a deal breaker in this business anymore. For the President of the United States, 55% of Republicans, 30% of Democrats, and 20% of independents would vote for a presidential candidate that they believe would lie to cover up the truth.
Stunning, isn't it? You have to put that in some context. There was a Fox News poll about 3 years ago, pre-Trump, that found only 15% of Republicans saying the same thing. And, you know, the way I look at it, so you have a spectrum of lying, all right? Where over here is the white lies, and then over here is the covering up criminal activity or doing something that harms people or harms national security. And I think every voter has to say, where on this spectrum do I say, okay, partisan politics will not let me go any farther than this. You know, my partisanship only goes this far. What we're seeing here is for 55% of those who responded, Republicans, I don't think there's any place on that spectrum where partisanship doesn't enter in and kind of make it okay. If we put it in context, though, I wonder if we went back 20 years and did a similar poll and asked Democrats about Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal and during some of the allegations against him, I'm guessing you would see Democrats being a lot more accepting of lying in office. This may not be a new thing, but it's disturbing because it says more about the voters themselves than it does about the candidates. You know, what are your core values as a voter? What are you willing to sacrifice for your party? Putting party over principle. That's disturbing.
Let's give one more piece of this poll to show whether or not it's the party, the politics, or the people that you just described as well. Because when you change the position that you're talking about to governor of a state, the numbers change dramatically. 29% of Republicans, 29% of Democrats, and 31% of independents would vote for a gubernatorial candidate that lied. Nicole? It changes a little bit, but we're still going to accept the lie, right?
Very interesting, but I think it's important to note, too, that when you ask about the president, people automatically think about who's currently the president, and maybe a lot of Republicans did vote for Trump. They didn't like it, but they had to feel like they had to be honest and answer that question honestly. Would you vote for somebody who lied? And they can't say no if they did vote for Trump.
What do you think, Tommy? Is it the Trump effect on this then? As just trying to stay congruent with how I voted or who I think I support?
Trump has changed politics in this country. I don't know for good for the rest of our lives. I don't know how long this will last, but he has changed politics where people are absolutely, like Nicole said, they think about him. And he's Teflon. It's amazing what he can say and do, and people still love him. They may not love everything he does, but they still love him, or he really, really hate them in some form. But yeah, he's changed the politics in the way that things that normally would not have been acceptable 5 years ago, 10 years ago, perfectly fine.
Do you think this lie spectrum that Jay just described for us is kind of the new thing in politics, Nicole? Is that just kind of...
I don't know about new. I think maybe we're thinking about it a lot more because of President Trump and all of everything he said and hasn't said.
Okay.
I think it's interesting to, would this apply to any other president and any other presidential candidate going forward? People kind of knew who they were getting when they voted for Trump. But if you have another candidate in 4 or 8 years who runs on a platform of honesty or has a different type of an image, maybe he or she doesn't get away with lying quite the same way.
Let's keep talking about candidates for just a moment. We got 2018, many important races, but one that we're watching closely in the state is Mitt Romney. Tommy, Mitt Romney had to weigh into the immigration issue this week, particularly as it relates to the Dreamers. What was his approach and some of the feedback?
It was a very fascinating approach, I guess would be the way to say that. So Romney was speaking in Utah County to a women's Republican group, and he was pretty much asked, differentiate yourself. How are you different than President Trump? And he says, well, you know, I'm more of a hawk on immigration issues. For example, I didn't believe that the Dreamers, the immigrants who are brought here as children really without their choice, should have a path to citizenship. Which is, a little different than what we thought he was saying, because when he announced this campaign, he's saying, we welcome immigrants in Utah and Washington excludes them. So we, wanted to dig down a little bit. Essentially what Romney is saying is, when I was 2012 presidential candidate, I opposed that. And now that we're in 2018, Obama's already given, protection for these Dreamers. Things are changed. The circumstances are different. So my position now is that they can stay if they, go to school, college, attend the military, serve in the military, become a teacher, something like that.
So, Nicole, help us understand those pieces right there, because what Tommy just described is what Mitt said. So they might need to do more to justify their citizenship status. Is this a position Utahns agree with, or the Dreamer support just goes beyond those issues?
Right. Utahns are very moderate on immigration, and even when it comes to DACA recipients, Utahns mostly believe that they should be able to stay in the country legally, which is one aspect that Mitt Romney differs from most Utahns on, by saying that there shouldn't be a special pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients. I think it's interesting that he chose the immigration topic to take a hard conservative line on, when he could have differentiated himself from President Trump on things like fiscal conservancy and being a budget hawk, things like that.
Okay. Yes, Jay.
It isn't. If you look at his website, he does say in there that he wants to have some kind of a merit-based system for achieving citizenship, but he doesn't say that about the Dreamers. He does say he supports DACA. I was a little confused by what he said this week, because I don't think he's ever said before that they need to prove themselves in order. But we have to remember too, I mean, this is March, and there's a lot of time to define candidates, and most people out there are not really tuned into what's going on politically.
Let's talk about one candidate who is trying to make his mark, Spencer Cox, right? Our current lieutenant governor has made some, well, other people are maybe making the movement for him this week, right? Jay, let's start with that for a second. He might be making his play for the 2020 governor for the state. Tell us what happened with this PAC, and how hard is it to run for governor when you're the lieutenant governor?
Well, the PAC was started by friends who want to urge him to run, and I think he's said that he may consider that. There's probably no office in the state that's more difficult to seek a higher office from than lieutenant governor. I remember years ago when Gary Herbert was lieutenant governor, he came to our Deseret News editorial board, and he had a huge binder that he gave us, and he had assembled of all the duties of lieutenant governor, because he wanted us to know that he was important and he had things to do. I remember, I'm old enough, I covered Norm Bangerter's office when he was governor. Val Ovison was his lieutenant governor, and he used to pull me into his office and try to say, look, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this. I'd kind of look at my watch, and I would never write anything about it. It's frustrating for a politician to be in an office that nobody pays any attention to. And so it's going to be hard for him, because I don't think most Utahns know who he is or what he's done.
But I was going to say the opposite. Doesn't it seem, and I've seen this from afar, but doesn't it seem like Spencer has one of the high-profile lieutenant governors we've had in a long time? He's out there talking about issues. He's not just sitting in his office and doing the election stuff. He's really out there, especially he has a nationwide kind of knowledge a little bit because of what he said after the Poltz nightclub shooting, about his own experiences with bullying. There's all these profiles of him being, the farmer out there and, then driving up to the Capitol. It seems like he's a little more, he's different.
I'll also say he has used social media in a way that I don't think I've seen any Utah politician do. And he really reaches out to Utahns, to young Utahns especially, through that platform.
Well, he does seem to do that. And of course, he draws on those great roots in Sanpete County and Fairview in particular. But Nicole, Governor Herbert is kind of promoting him to some extent also. Is that going to give him much of an advantage? Maybe it's enough to counter what we just heard.
Yeah, I don't think it's not a disadvantage, I would say. I don't think it hurts to have the support of Governor if you're running for that office.
Okay.
It's early yet, right?
Yeah.
And
it's March, right?
Right. And I agree with all that you're saying about how he's tried to keep himself in the limelight. The problem is the Lieutenant Governor's office doesn't enact anything, doesn't do anything official, and it's early. Possibly, if he's running against Greg Hughes, here's a Speaker of the House who's been very vocal, very active, and who has headed up this Project Rio Grande and the homeless issue and all that in Salt Lake. What I'm saying is that it helps to come from an office, a public office, where you've enacted things and done things.
Okay. Tommy, one last question with this insight that Nicole just gave us a moment ago about social media. Spencer Cox is great at it, but what is happening nationally with people engaging now that things are happening with things like Facebook?
It's fascinating to see that candidates know this now. They don't necessarily need the media. I hope they want to keep us around. But, you can go around when you have, I don't know how many followers Spencer has, but it's tens of thousands probably. He's got a way to go around the filter of the media, to spread his message, to get his base activated, to send out and call for help. Same with Facebook. Facebook's a new way to drill down and find the people you want. The question is, can you translate that into votes?
Very good. Thank you for your insights today. That's it for tonight's show. For more discussion and past episodes, please join us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.